The Alpha King's Redemption, Part 2. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart ache, like this video, subscribe and step into the pack, because these stories only get deeper from here. The council chamber fell silent as Alderon's words hung in the air. Catherine stood frozen near the doorway, the weight of 30 pairs of eyes suddenly turning toward her, making her skin prickle with discomfort. "Your Majesty," an elderly Beta councilman said carefully, his tone walking the razor's edge between respect and reproach. "With all due respect, the concerns of the nobility are not without merit. The changes you've proposed are extensive. Radical, even. The economic implications alone—" "The economic implications," Alderon interrupted, his voice dropping to a tone that made several councilmen flinch. "Of continuing to operate forced labor camps, traffic children, and systematically murder Omega workers are far worse than any temporary disruption my reforms might cause. Or would you like to explain to this council how profiting from slavery is economically preferable to operating a legitimate economy?" The councilman's face flushed, but he pressed on. "That's not what I meant, Your Majesty. Of course, the criminal elements must be addressed, but the complete erasure of all Omega debts, the immediate shutdown of all labor facilities without transition periods, the wholesale investigation of every official, these actions create chaos. They destabilize a system built on exploitation," Alderon said flatly. "Good. It should be destabilized. It should be torn down to its foundations and rebuilt properly." Another councilman, younger and bolder, spoke up. "And the girl, Your Majesty, is it true you lived with her? As a beggar? In her home?" Catherine felt her face burn with humiliation. The way he said "her home" made their leaning hut sound like a brothel, made her act of basic kindness sound like something sordid and manipulative. "Yes," Alderon said simply, offering no explanation, no justification, his silver eyes daring anyone to make something of it. "Your Majesty, surely you understand how this appears," a third councilman ventured. "An Omega girl shelters a mysterious stranger, and within weeks that stranger is revealed to be the king himself, who then proceeds to overturn centuries of established social order, claiming it's all due to witnessing injustice. Some might say, and Bohr certainly is saying, that this appears less like divine justice and more like influence, manipulation even." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain that she'd had no idea who Alderon was, that she'd never asked for any of this, but Alderon's voice cut through before she could speak. "Some might say that," Alderon agreed, his tone glacial. "Those same people might also say that a king who sits in his tower reviewing falsified reports while his people are enslaved and murdered is fulfilling his duty. Those people would be wrong on both counts." He leaned forward, his hands planted on the table, his posture radiating controlled fury. "Catherine offered me half her bread when she had nothing. She worked herself to exhaustion to care for her unshifted brother. She maintained her integrity in a system designed to crush it. The only thing she influenced was my understanding of what true strength looks like. And if that makes me unfit to rule in your eyes, then perhaps you're the ones who shouldn't be sitting in this council chamber." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Finally, Meredith spoke from her position near the wall, her blind eyes somehow making her seem more perceptive than anyone else in the room. The king asks not for your approval of his methods, but for your commitment to justice. Will you stand with him in rooting out corruption, or will you align yourselves with Boor's rebellion and face the consequences of that choice? It was a clear ultimatum, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who could see futures that others couldn't. One by one, the councilmen bowed their heads in acceptance, some enthusiastic, some reluctant, but all acknowledging the reality that opposing their king openly would mean joining Boor's doomed rebellion. "Good," Alderaan said. "General Aldrich, prepare the armies. We march on the northern stronghold in 1 week. I want Boor and every official who's joined him arrested and charged with treason. No mercy, no negotiations, no second chances." "Yes, Your Majesty," the general replied crisply. "The rest of you, begin implementing the reforms immediately. I want every labor camp emptied within 3 days. I want every separated family reunited within the week. I want investigators combing through financial records of every official who's served under Boor. And I want a new system of oversight established so that this can never happen again." The councilmen filed out, leaving Catherine and Owen alone with Alderaan and Meredith. Alderaan's shoulders sagged the moment the door closed, his regal bearing dropping away to reveal the exhaustion underneath. He looked at Catherine with an expression that made her heart ache. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry they questioned your integrity. I'm sorry this has become complicated. I'm sorry I've dragged you into the middle of a political crisis." "You didn't drag me anywhere," Catherine replied, finding her voice finally. "I chose to help a beggar. That's on me." "You chose to help another person," Alderaan corrected. "There's no shame in that. And whatever those councilmen think, whatever Boor claims, you and I both know the truth." "You didn't manipulate me. You saved me." Catherine wanted to respond, wanted to say something profound or comforting or meaningful, but Owen spoke first. "Are we really going to war?" he asked, his voice small and frightened in a way Catherine hadn't heard since their parents died. "Real war? With people dying?" Alderaan knelt so he was eye level with the boy, his expression gentle. "I hope not. I hope Boor surrenders when he realizes he can't win. But if he fights—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then yes, there will be a battle, and people will likely die. That's the cost of confronting evil, Owen. Sometimes it fights back." "Will you be there?" Owen asked. "In the battle?" "I'll lead it," Alderaan confirmed. "What if you die?" The blunt question hung in the air, voicing the fear Catherine hadn't dared to speak aloud. "Then my heir will continue the work I've started," Alderaan said. "The reforms will stand. The corruption will be rooted out. Justice will be served. My death wouldn't change any of that." "But it would change everything for us," Owen said, tears welling in his eyes. "You're the first person besides Kat who's ever protected me, who's ever made me feel like maybe being unshifted doesn't make me worthless. If you die, that goes away." Alderaan pulled Owen into a hug, and Catherine felt her own eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. "I'm not going to die," Alderaan promised, though they all knew it was a promise he couldn't guarantee. "I'm too stubborn and I have too much left to do, Besides, he glanced at Catherine over Owen's shoulder, his expression shifting to something warmer. I made a commitment to keep existing in your lives. I don't break my commitments. The week before the march was chaos contained by military precision. Catherine watched from palace windows as armies assembled in the courtyards below. Thousands of soldiers in gleaming armor, their ranks organized with the efficiency of long practice. Supply wagons rolled through the gates in endless processions. Blacksmiths worked day and night repairing weapons and armor. The entire palace hummed with preparation for war. And through it all, Alderaan moved like the eye of a storm, calm, focused, issuing orders with the casual authority of someone who had commanded armies for decades. Catherine saw glimpses of him throughout each day, always surrounded by generals or councilmen or messengers, always engaged in strategy sessions or logistics meetings or diplomatic negotiations with allied pacts. She hadn't spoken to him privately since the council meeting. She told herself it was because he was busy, because war preparations took precedence, because a king didn't have time for personal conversations with Omega girls who'd gotten swept up in political upheaval. She didn't examine too closely why that thought made her chest ache. On the third night, Catherine couldn't sleep. The palace was too quiet after sunset, the silence oppressive after a lifetime of living in a hut where she could hear every sound of the village around her. She wandered the halls, telling herself she was exploring, definitely not hoping to accidentally encounter a certain king who was probably working late in his study. She found him on a training balcony, moving through sword forms with fluid grace that made combat look like dance. Moonlight gleamed off his bare torso. He'd stripped to the waist for the exercise, highlighting muscles that came from actual labor, not decorative posturing. Sweat ran down his skin as he moved, each strike and parry executed with perfect precision. Catherine watched from the shadows, transfixed by the beauty and danger of his movements, until he spoke without pausing his forms. You can come out, Catherine. I've known you were there for 5 minutes. She stepped into the moonlight, embarrassed at being caught. I couldn't sleep. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting. Alderaan finished his current sequence, then lowered his sword and reached for a towel, wiping sweat from his face. I couldn't sleep either. Too much thinking, not enough action. Training helps. Catherine moved to the balcony railing, looking out at the city below. Lights twinkled in windows across the sprawling capital, so many lives unaware of the war brewing on their northern border. Are you frightened? She asked quietly. About the battle? Terrified, Alderaan admitted, surprising her with his honesty. Not of dying. I've made peace with my mortality years ago, but of failing, of not being fast enough or smart enough or strong enough to protect everyone who's counting on me, of making the wrong call and watching good people die because of my mistake. He joined her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the clean scent of his sweat mixed with something uniquely him, pine and winter air and moonlight. You've commanded armies for decades, Catherine said. You've won 32 wars. Surely you're not worried about your tactical abilities. Tactical ability and moral certainty are different things, Alderaan replied. I've never doubted my capability to win battles, but I've also never fought a war where I cared so much about the outcome beyond victory itself. He paused, then added more quietly, I've never fought a war where losing would mean failing someone who matters more than the crown. Catherine's breath caught. She turned to look at him and found him already watching her, his silver eyes reflecting moonlight, his expression open and vulnerable in ways kings weren't supposed to be. "You don't have to say things like that," she whispered. "I know this is complicated. I know there are rules and expectations and political realities. You don't have to pretend that an Omega girl you knew for a month is—" "I'm not pretending anything," Alderaan interrupted gently. "And I've spent my entire life following rules and meeting expectations and managing political realities. For once, just once, I want to be honest about what I feel without calculating the consequences first." "And what do you feel?" Catherine asked, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Alderaan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with fingers that trembled slightly. "I feel like the beggar who showed up in Ashenvale a month ago died and was reborn as someone who finally understands what it means to be alive. I feel like sharing bread by a cold fire pit was more significant than signing 100 peace treaties. I feel like watching you smile at Owen when you thought no one was looking taught me more about leadership than 30 years of war. And I feel—" his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper— "like if I survive this battle but lose you afterward, the victory will be worthless." Catherine couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this powerful, dangerous, impossibly complicated man who was looking at her like she hung the moon. "I'm nobody," she said finally, the words emerging as a desperate attempt to inject reality into this moment. "I'm an Omega with no education, no status, no family name worth mentioning. You're the Alpha King. This, whatever this is, it can't work. The council would never accept it. The nobility would revolt. You'd be destroying your authority for you," Alderaan finished. "Yes, I would." "You can't mean that." "Catherine." He said her name like a prayer, like a promise, like something sacred. "I've commanded armies and conquered kingdoms and accumulated more power than most wolves see in 10 lifetimes. None of it made me feel the way you made me feel when you offered me half your bread. None of it taught me what you taught me about strength and kindness and what actually matters in this world. So yes, I would trade every bit of my authority, every ounce of my power, every crown and title and territory, if that's what it took to keep you in my life." "That's insane," Catherine whispered. But her body was betraying her, leaning toward him despite her words, drawn by something deeper than logic or reason. "Probably," Alderaan agreed and smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "But I've been sane and reasonable for 40 years, and it got me a kingdom full of corruption and a heart so armored I'd forgotten it could feel anything. I think it's time I tried insanity." He leaned closer, his hand still cradling her face, his eyes searching hers for permission. Catherine knew she should pull away, knew this was dangerous and complicated and would create political nightmares, knew that Omega girls didn't kiss Alpha Kings, that fairy tales didn't happen in real life, that this moment would shatter the moment reality intruded. She kissed him anyway. His lips were soft and warm against hers, the kiss gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed. His other hand came up to cup her face, cradling her like she was something precious and breakable, even though she'd proven herself anything but breakable. Catherine's hands found his bare chest, feeling his heart hammering as hard as hers, feeling the heat of his skin, feeling alive and terrified and exhilarated all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alderaan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still going to war in 4 days," he said quietly. "And I still might die. And even if I survive, this is still going to be complicated and difficult and potentially disastrous for both of us. None of that has changed." "I know," Catherine replied. "But I want you to know, I need you to know, that whatever happens, you changed everything. You changed me. And I'm grateful for that. Even if the timing is terrible and the circumstances are impossible." Catherine pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. "Then come back alive. Come back victorious. Come back and we'll figure out the rest together." "Is that an order?" Alderaan asked, his tone teasing, but his eyes serious. "Yes," Catherine said firmly. "Consider it a royal decree from the Omega girl who saved your life by sharing bread." Alderaan laughed, the sound free and genuine, and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while the moon climbed higher and the city slept below them, unaware that their king had just found something worth fighting for, beyond duty or honor or tradition. He had found love, and kingdoms had fallen for less. The morning of the march dawned cold and gray, with clouds rolling in from the north like a physical manifestation of the conflict ahead. Catherine stood on the same balcony where she'd kissed Alderaan 3 nights ago, watching the army assemble in the courtyard below. 10,000 soldiers in perfect formation, their armor gleaming despite the overcast sky, their banners bearing the wolf and stars crest of the Alpha King. It should have been inspiring. Instead, it terrified her. Because somewhere in that vast sea of soldiers was Alderaan, preparing to ride north toward a battle that could kill him, could end this fragile thing growing between them before it had a chance to truly begin. "He's good at this, you know," Meredith said from behind her, materializing as she always did, silent and sudden. "War, strategy, combat. He's one of the finest military minds of his generation. If anyone can win this with minimal casualties, it's him." "I know," Catherine replied, not taking her eyes off the courtyard. "That doesn't make it easier to watch him leave." "No," Meredith agreed. "Love never makes anything easier. It just makes everything matter more." Catherine turned to look at the old seer, surprised by the bluntness. "Is it that obvious? To someone who can see the threads of fate?" Meredith smiled. "Yes. To most others? They're beginning to suspect. The way he looks at you, the way you've been avoiding him for 3 days, only to spend half of last night on that balcony with him. People notice these things." Catherine felt her face heat. "We haven't. I mean, nothing improper." "I'm not judging, child," Meredith interrupted gently. "I'm warning. Bor is already using your connection to discredit Alderaan. If it becomes public knowledge that the king has formed an attachment to an Omega girl, the political fallout will be significant." "Then what should I do?" Catherine asked, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Pretend I don't care? Leave the palace? Hide in shadows and hope no one notices?" "You should," Meredith said carefully. "Do what your heart tells you is right, and then prepare for the consequences, whatever they may be." She paused, her blind eyes somehow finding Catherine's with unsettling accuracy. "But know this. Fate has tangled your thread with his. Whether you choose to acknowledge that publicly or not, the pattern is set. You will shape his future. He will shape yours. The only question is whether you'll do it together or separately." Before Catherine could formulate a response to this cryptic pronouncement, a horn sounded from below, the signal that the march was beginning. Her heart lurched. "Go," Meredith said softly. "Say goodbye properly. You'll regret it forever if you don't." Catherine ran. She flew through palace corridors, her Omega speed finally useful for something other than avoiding guards or outrunning debt collectors. She burst into the courtyard just as Alderaan was mounting his warhorse, a massive black stallion that suited him perfectly, all controlled power and barely restrained danger. He saw her immediately, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. Catherine didn't care that 10,000 soldiers were watching, didn't care that councilmen and nobles and generals were present, didn't care about propriety or politics or the consequences Meredith had warned about. She ran straight to him. Alderaan dismounted in one fluid motion, catching her as she crashed into his arms, holding her tight despite his armor, despite the sword at his hip, despite everything that said a king shouldn't embrace an Omega girl in full view of his entire army. "Come back," Catherine whispered against his chest, her voice fierce despite the tears she was fighting. "Come back to me alive and whole, or I swear I'll march into whatever afterlife you've gone to and drag you back myself." Alderaan's laugh rumbled through his chest. "That's the second most romantic threat anyone's ever made to me." "What was the first?" "You, promising to make me carry stones if I didn't earn my keep." He pulled back enough to look at her face, his expression soft despite the warrior's armor he wore. "I'll come back, Catherine. I promise. I have too many things left to say to you, too many arguments to win, too many meals to share." "You'd better," Catherine said, trying for stern but landing somewhere closer to desperate. "Owen and I are getting used to regular meals and warm beds. If you die and we have to go back to poverty, I'm going to be very annoyed with you." "Can't have that," Alderaan murmured, then leaned down and kissed her, brief but thorough, a claiming and a promise all in one gesture. The courtyard erupted in a mix of shocked gasps and enthusiastic cheers. The soldiers, at least, seemed delighted by this development, while the nobles looked varying degrees of scandalized. When they broke apart, Alderaan kept his forehead pressed to hers for one more moment. "Wait for me," he said quietly, just for her. "Always," Catherine replied. Then he was mounting his horse again, his posture shifting to the commanding presence of an alpha king leading his armies to war. He raised his sword, and 10,000 voices roared in response. The march began. Catherine watched from the courtyard as the army flowed through the palace gates like a river of steel and determination. She watched until the last soldier disappeared from view, until the sound of marching feet faded to silence, until nothing remained but dust and absence. "Come on, Cat," Owen said, appearing at her elbow and taking her hand. "Let's go inside. Watching won't bring them back faster." "I know," Catherine said, but didn't move, because somewhere in her chest, her wolf, which had been quiet her entire life, never manifesting despite her Omega status, suddenly stirred. A warning, a premonition. A certainty that this war would change everything, that the man who rode north as Alpha King might return as something else entirely, if he returned at all. The northern stronghold sat like a scar on the landscape, Black stone walls rising from bare rock, towers that looked like claws grasping at the sky, banners bearing Boar's new crest, a wolf's head with its jaws open, dripping blood, snapping in the harsh wind. Alderaan studied it from a ridge half a mile away, his enhanced vision picking out details that worried him. The fortifications were stronger than intelligence had suggested. The garrison was larger, and something about the way the defenders moved suggested professional military training, not the hastily assembled rebels he'd expected. "Thoughts?" he asked General Aldrich, who stood beside him with a looking-glass raised. "He's been preparing for this longer than we realized," Aldrich said grimly. "Those aren't just corrupt officials and sympathetic nobles behind those walls. That's a professional army. I'd estimate 3,000 soldiers, well-armed and well-trained." "Outnumbered but entrenched," Alderaan mused. "Classic defensive advantage. He's going to make us come to him, bleed us on those walls, hope we lose enough soldiers that the nobility back home starts questioning whether this war is worth the cost." "We could siege them," Aldrich suggested. "Surround and starve them out. It would take months, but we'd minimize casualties." "Months we don't have," Alderaan replied. "Every day this drags on, Boar sends out more propaganda, recruits more supporters, makes more political inroads. No, we need to end this quickly and decisively." He lowered his looking-glass and turned to face his general. "Prepare for a direct assault. Dawn tomorrow. 3-pronged attack, center, east, and west walls simultaneously. I'll lead the center." "Your Majesty, if you're killed—" "Then you take command and finish this," Alderaan interrupted calmly. "But I won't be killed. I've fought too long and survived too much to die on Boar's walls. Besides," a slight smile crossed his face, "I made a promise to a very stubborn Omega girl that I'd come back alive. I don't break my promises." That night, Alderaan walked through the camp, checking on his soldiers, offering words of encouragement, making sure morale remained high despite the daunting task ahead. They were good men and women, these warriors who'd chosen to follow him into battle against their own countrymen. They deserved a king who saw them as people, not just tactical pieces to be moved on a war board. As midnight approached, Alderaan retired to his command tent and found an unexpected visitor waiting. Meredith sat in his campaign chair, her blind eyes somehow managing to convey disapproval despite their clouded sightlessness. "You shouldn't be here," Alderaan said, more amused than alarmed. "This is a war camp, not a palace gathering. And you shouldn't be planning to lead tomorrow's assault personally," Meredith countered. "Yet here we both are, doing things we shouldn't." Alderaan poured himself wine and settled into a second chair. "I assume you're here to tell me I'm going to die tomorrow, or that I'm making a terrible mistake, or both?" "I'm here to tell you," Meredith said carefully, "that fate has reached a branching point. 2 possible futures diverge from tomorrow's battle, and both are equally probable." "That's unusually unhelpful, even for a prophecy," Alderaan observed. Meredith didn't smile. "In one future, you storm the walls and win a glorious victory. Boar is captured and executed. The corruption is rooted out. Your reforms proceed. The kingdom enters a new age of justice and prosperity." "And in the other future?" "In the other future," Meredith said quietly, You die on those walls. Not in glorious combat, but betrayed by someone you trust. Stabbed in the back while fighting on the front lines. Your death throws the kingdom into chaos. Civil war erupts. And Catherine... She paused, her expression pained. Catherine loses everything all over again. The tent fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the camp, soldiers talking, fires crackling, horses moving in their lines. "Who betrays me?" Alderaan asked finally. "That I cannot see. The threads are tangled, obscured by conflicting choices and uncertain loyalties. Someone close to you will make a decision tomorrow. If they choose honor, you live. If they choose ambition, you die." "Then I'll watch my back," Alderaan said pragmatically. "You're remarkably calm about this." "I've been told I'm going to die in battle at least a dozen times over the years," Alderaan replied with a slight smile. "At some point, death threats lose their impact. Besides, if fate can be changed by awareness, then you've just changed it by warning me. If it can't be changed, then worrying is pointless. Either way, I'm still attacking at dawn." Meredith stood, her robes rustling. "Catherine asked me to tell you something. Before I left the palace." Alderaan's expression softened. "What did she say?" "She said, 'Tell him I'm not waiting patiently like some helpless maiden in a tower. Tell him I'm preparing. And if he doesn't come back, I'm coming to get him.'" Meredith smiled. "She's quite fierce, your Omega girl." "She's not my—" Alderaan started, then stopped, realizing the denial was pointless. "Yes, she is." "Then for her sake, if not for your kingdom's, be careful tomorrow. Trust your instincts. Watch for the knife aimed at your back. And remember, not all enemies stand in front of you." Meredith vanished as mysteriously as she'd appeared, leaving Alderaan alone with his thoughts and his wine, and a prophecy that offered warning without enough detail to be useful. He thought about Catherine, about the way she'd kissed him in the courtyard, about the fierce determination in her eyes when she'd told him to come back. He thought about Owen, unshifted and vulnerable, who'd found his first real protector outside his sister. He thought about all the Omega families still waiting for reunification, still hoping for justice, still depending on him to finish what he'd started. Then he set down his wine, checked his weapons, and prepared for tomorrow's battle. If someone was planning to betray him, they'd find the Alpha King was much harder to kill than they anticipated. Dawn broke red and angry over the northern stronghold. Alderaan stood at the head of his center column, 5,000 soldiers at his back, siege ladders ready, battering rams positioned, archers prepared to provide covering fire. To his left and right, the eastern and western columns waited for his signal. On the walls above, Boar's defenders jeered and taunted, confident in their fortifications. Alderaan raised his sword. The horn sounded, and hell descended on the northern stronghold. The first wave hit the walls like a tsunami of steel and fury. Ladders slammed against stone, soldiers scrambling up with shields raised against the arrows raining down from above. The battering ram thundered against the main gate, each impact making the ground shake. Archers fired in coordinated volleys, forcing defenders to duck behind crenellations. Alderaan was in the thick of it immediately, his alpha strength allowing him to scale the wall faster than normal soldiers, his sword cutting through defenders who tried to push the ladders back. He crested the battlements with a roar that was more wolf than human, his presence on the wall galvanizing his soldiers to push harder, climb faster, fight fiercer. For 2 hours, the battle raged. Slowly, inexorably, Alderon's forces gained ground. The eastern wall fell first, his soldiers pouring through a breach and fighting their way toward the gates from the inside. The western wall held longer, but eventually succumbed to overwhelming numbers. By midday, Alderon's forces controlled 2/3 of the stronghold. Bor had retreated to the central keep, his last defensive position, making his final stand with approximately 500 loyalists. Alderon gathered his commanders for a final assault strategy when it happened. General Aldrich, trusted advisor and commander for 15 years, stepped close to point out something on the tactical map. And Alderon felt it, that prickle of wrongness, that instinctive warning his wolf had learned to heed over decades of survival. He moved purely on instinct, twisting away just as Aldrich's knife, poisoned, he would learn later, with a toxin designed specifically to kill alphas, slashed through the space where his kidneys had been a heartbeat before. The tent erupted into chaos. Guards seized Aldrich, who didn't struggle, his expression a mix of regret and resignation. "Why?" Alderon asked, his voice deadly calm despite the fury in his eyes. "Because you've lost your mind," Aldrich said flatly. "An Omega girl? Reforms that threaten the entire social order? You're destroying everything our ancestors built because you spent a month living in poverty and fell in love with the first woman who showed you kindness. You're not fit to rule anymore. So Bor convinced you I needed to die. Bor convinced me the kingdom needed protecting from your corruption," Aldrich corrected. "He promised me the position of Alpha King, promised to restore proper order, promised to undo your disastrous reforms. All I had to do was remove you during the chaos of battle." Alderon stared at his former general, feeling a cold anger that transcended rage. "You just tried to assassinate your king because you disapproved of who I love. And you think that makes you the defender of proper order?" "I think it makes me pragmatic," Aldrich replied. "You would have destroyed the kingdom for her. I'm saving it from you." "No," Alderon said quietly. "You're a traitor who sold his honor for a crown you'll never wear. Guards, take him to the dungeons. He'll stand trial with Bor." As Aldrich was dragged away, still protesting his patriotic intentions, Alderon felt the full weight of Meredith's prophecy settle onto his shoulders. The betrayal had come, but he'd survived it, which meant the future where he lived, where he won, where he returned to Catherine. That future was now the one fate had chosen. With renewed determination and a borrowed commander taking Aldrich's place, Alderon led the final assault on the central keep. Bor fought like a cornered animal, viscous, desperate, and surprisingly skilled for a bureaucrat. The battle inside the keep was brutal in close quarters, the kind of fighting where rank mattered less than strength and will to survive. They met finally in the keep's great hall, surrounded by the bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides. "You should have stayed in your tower," Bor snarled, circling with his sword raised. "You should have kept reviewing my reports and signing my documents and pretending everything was fine. We were both happy. The kingdom was profitable. Why did you have to ruin it?" "Because people were dying," Alderon replied, matching Bor's movements. "Because children were being trafficked. because an Omega girl showed me that profit built on suffering isn't worth having." "The Omega girl," Boar laughed bitterly. "It all comes back to her, doesn't it? You've destroyed your kingdom, split your nobility, triggered a civil war. All because some poverty-stricken Omega shared her bread with you. Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds?" "Do you have any idea?" Alderaan countered, his voice dropping to a growl. "How pathetic it sounds that you can't understand why that matters." They clashed. The fight was short but intense. Boar was skilled, but Alderaan was an alpha king who'd spent 30 years in warfare. Within minutes, Boar was on his knees, Alderaan's sword at his throat. "Yield," Alderaan commanded. Boar smiled through bloodied teeth. "And give you the satisfaction of a public trial, of parading me through the capital in chains? No, thank you, Your Majesty. I'll choose my own ending." Before Alderaan could stop him, Boar grabbed a fallen dagger and drove it into his own heart. He was dead before he hit the floor. The hall fell silent. And just like that, the rebellion was over. The march back to the capital took 3 days. They traveled with prisoners, 400 corrupt officials, loyalists, and co-conspirators who would face trial for their crimes. They traveled with wounded, 8. Continue John 200 soldiers who'd survive but would carry scars from this battle for the rest of their lives. They traveled with dead, 2,000 men and women who'd given their lives to root out corruption, whose names would be carved into memorial stones and honored for generations. Alderaan felt the weight of every death. Victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy, like wearing chains made of responsibility and consequence. On the second night, as they camped under stars, a messenger rode in from the capital. "Your Majesty," the messenger said, dismounting hastily. "Urgent news from the palace." Alderaan's heart dropped. Something in the messenger's expression spoke of disaster. "What happened?" "It's the Omega girl, Your Majesty. Catherine. She's—" The messenger hesitated. "She's what?" Alderaan demanded, his calm shattering. "Is she hurt? Dead? Tell me." "She's gone, Your Majesty. 3 days ago. She left a note saying she couldn't stay in the palace, couldn't wait helplessly while you fought. She's disappeared, and no one knows where." Alderaan felt his world tilt. "Her brother?" he asked through numb lips. "Owen is still at the palace, safe and well, but he won't tell anyone where his sister went. He says she made him promise." Alderaan stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities, each worse than the last. Catherine alone in a kingdom still hostile to Omegas who didn't know their place. Catherine vulnerable to enemies who might target her to hurt him. Catherine in danger because he'd kissed her publicly and made her a symbol, a target, a liability. "Pack everything," he ordered, his voice cutting through the camp. "We march through the night. I want to be in the capital by dawn." "Your Majesty, the wounded—" "Will be transported as quickly and carefully as possible," Alderaan interrupted. "But I'm riding ahead with a small force. Now." He was on his horse within minutes, 50 of his fastest riders assembled behind him, pushing their mounts to the edge of endurance in a desperate race back to the capital. He'd won his war. But he might have just lost his heart. Catherine knelt in the ruins of Ashenvale's old temple, surrounded by Omega families who'd gathered at her summons. She'd left the palace 3 days ago, unable to sit in luxury while Alderaan fought a war that had started because of her. unable to play the helpless maiden waiting for her king to return, unable to be passive when she could be useful. So she'd come here, to the village where everything started, and begun the work that needed doing. "The king's decree means nothing if we don't claim it," she told the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite her fear. "The debt jubilee exists on paper, but how many of you have actually had your debts formally canceled? How many have received written confirmation? How many have been told by local officials that the decree doesn't apply to your specific circumstances?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The king might have issued sweeping reforms, but implementation required follow-through. And corrupt local officials were still trying to maintain their power by ignoring or circumventing the new orders. "We need to organize," Catherine continued. "We need to document every debt, every contract, every case where officials are still trying to enforce the old system. We need to create a network of Omega advocates who can read the legal documents, understand the new laws, and help families navigate the bureaucracy." An elderly Omega woman raised her hand. "And who's going to teach us to read legal documents, child? Who's going to explain laws written by betas for betas?" "I am," said a new voice. Catherine turned to find a beta woman stepping forward, Magistrate Lydia, one of the few local officials who'd consistently opposed Boor's corruption. "The king's reforms are meaningless if Omegas can't access them," Lydia said firmly. "I'll teach classes on legal literacy. I'll provide templates for challenging improper debts. I'll testify against any officials still trying to enforce the old system." More voices joined in. A beta merchant offering to employ Omega workers at fair wages, an alpha landowner promising to lease farmland to Omega families at reasonable rates. Even some guards, young ones who'd been disgusted by the old system, volunteering to protect Omega gatherings from harassment. Catherine felt hope kindle in her chest. This was how real change happened. Not through royal decrees alone, but through people choosing to implement those decrees at ground level, through communities organizing to claim the rights that law gave them but practice still denied. For 3 days, she'd worked from dawn until long after dark, organizing meetings, documenting cases, connecting families with resources, building the framework of a system that could sustain the reforms even if political winds shifted. For 3 days, she'd tried not to think about Alderaan, about whether he was alive or dead, about whether she'd made the right choice leaving the palace, or whether she'd just thrown away the most important thing that had ever happened to her. On the 4th morning, she woke in her old leaning hut, because sleeping in the palace while others suffered in poverty had felt obscene, to find a massive black warhorse tied outside her door. And sitting on her doorstep, looking exhausted and furious and desperately relieved all at once, was the Alpha King. "You left," Alderaan said without preamble. "You noticed," Catherine replied, her heart doing things that hearts definitely shouldn't do. "I won a war and came back to find you'd vanished. Yes, I noticed." "You won," Catherine said, relief flooding through her. "You're alive? You're unhurt?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally, I've aged about 10 years in the past 4 days. Do you have any idea what it's like to ride into battle knowing you might die, only to survive and discover that surviving doesn't matter because the person you were fighting to come back to has disappeared?" Catherine felt guilt twist in her stomach. "I left you a note. I can't wait passively. There's work to be done. Don't worry about me." "That's not a note, Catherine. That's a nightmare wrapped in insufficient detail." I'm sorry, Catherine said and meant it. But I couldn't just sit there being decorative and helpless. You were fighting a war. I needed to fight mine. Alderaan stared at her for a long moment, then started laughing, deep, genuine laughter that made his whole frame shake. What's funny? Catherine asked, confused and slightly offended. You are, Alderaan said, standing and pulling her into his arms. You're absolutely insane, completely frustrating, and utterly perfect. I was terrified you'd been kidnapped, or hurt, or worse, and the entire time you were here, organizing a grassroots implementation of my legal reforms. Why are you like this? Because someone once told me that sharing your last piece of bread with a stranger matters more than all the gold in a treasury, Catherine replied, her voice muffled against his chest. And I decided that if kindness matters, then justice matters too. You can't have one without the other. Alderaan pulled back enough to look at her face, his expression soft despite the exhaustion etched into his features. I love you, he said simply. I probably shouldn't. It's definitely going to cause political nightmares. But I love you anyway, and I'm done pretending I don't. Catherine's breath caught. You can't love me. I'm nobody. You're the woman who taught me how to be human again, Alderaan interrupted. You're the woman who shared her bread when she had nothing else to give. You're the woman who worked herself to exhaustion to protect her brother. You're the woman who left a palace to organize Omega advocacy networks instead of waiting passively for your king to return. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for until I found it. The nobility will never accept it, Catherine whispered, even as her heart was singing with joy. An Alpha King and an Omega, it's unprecedented, scandalous. They'll say I'm corrupting you, manipulating you, that I'm— Let them say whatever they want, Alderaan said fiercely. I've spent my entire life meeting their expectations, following their rules, being the king they wanted me to be. It got me 30 years of warfare and a kingdom rotting from corruption I was too blind to see. If choosing you means disappointing them, then I'll disappoint them gladly. You'll lose political support, Catherine warned, even as her resolve was crumbling. I'll gain something more valuable, a partner who actually cares about the same things I do. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who understands what it means to struggle and survive and still choose kindness. I need that more than I need political support. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of joy rather than exhaustion or fear. I love you too, she admitted. I've been trying not to, trying to be practical and realistic and smart about this, but I love you anyway. Alderaan kissed her then, thorough and claiming and full of promises about futures they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, Catherine noticed they had an audience. Omega families from the meeting last night had gathered, watching their king kiss an Omega girl in front of a leaning hut, bearing witness to something unprecedented and scandalous and beautiful. Is this real? An old woman asked, her voice trembling with hope. The Alpha King and an Omega truly together, not as master and servant, but as equals. Yes, Alderaan said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his arm still around Catherine's waist. This is real, and anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me personally. The crowd erupted in cheers, wild, joyful, disbelieving cheers, from people who'd never expected to see their king choose one of them, never expected to see love transcend the rigid hierarchy that had defined their entire world. And watching them celebrate, Catherine felt something shift in her chest. Her wolf, silent her entire life, suddenly stirred, not awakening fully, not yet, but stretching, yawning, making its presence known for the first times, as if love had been the key to unlocking something that fear and poverty and despair had kept locked away. The noble council met 3 days after Alderon's return to the capital, and the atmosphere was already hostile before he even entered the room. Catherine wasn't present. Alderon had offered to bring her, but she'd declined, saying this was a battle he needed to fight alone first. But he felt her support like a tangible thing, strengthening his resolve. "Your Majesty," Councilman Aldrich began the moment Alderon took his seat, not even bothering with pleasantries. "We need to discuss this situation with the Omega girl." "Her name is Catherine," Alderon corrected mildly, "and there's nothing to discuss. I've made my choice clear." "Your choice," another councilman interjected, his tone dripping with condescension, "affects the entire kingdom. The nobility is in an uproar. You've just finished putting down one rebellion. Do you really want to trigger another by pursuing this relationship? If the nobility chooses to rebel because I love someone they consider beneath my station," Alderon said calmly, "then perhaps I need a better class of nobility." The room erupted in outraged protests. Alderon let them vent for 30 seconds, then slammed his hand on the table with enough force to crack the wood, his alpha dominance flooding the room like a physical wave. Every wolf present immediately fell silent, their instincts recognizing absolute authority even if their human sensibilities objected to it. "I will say this once," Alderon said, his voice quiet, but carrying death in its undertones. "I have spent the last month living as my Omega subjects live. I have felt their hunger, worked their jobs, witnessed their suffering. I have seen the corruption that was hidden from me for years. I have torn down a system of exploitation and begun implementing reforms that will reshape this kingdom into something approaching actual justice. And the woman you're denigrating as the Omega girl taught me more about leadership and courage than any of you have in decades of service." "But Your Majesty," Aldrich tried again, "there are protocols. Protocols that serve no purpose except maintaining arbitrary hierarchies," Alderon interrupted. "Protocols that would have me marry some alpha or beta noble for political alliance while my Omega subjects are trafficked and murdered. Protocols that value bloodlines over character, rank over capability, tradition over justice. I'm done with those protocols." "You're asking us to accept an Omega as queen," another councilman said flatly. "The nobility will never—" "I'm not asking," Alderon corrected. "I'm informing. Catherine will be my mate. Whether she becomes queen formally or not is something we'll discuss privately, but our relationship is not subject to your approval or disapproval. Is that clear?" The councilmen exchanged glances, clearly torn between their ingrained prejudices and the recognition that their king was absolutely serious. Finally, Lady Morrigan, one of the few female council members, spoke up. "Your Majesty, I think what my colleagues are trying to express, albeit poorly, is concern for your political stability. The reforms you've implemented are already controversial." Adding a romantic scandal to the mix could undermine your authority at a critical moment." Alderaan appreciated that she at least phrased it as concern rather than condemnation. "I understand their worries. But my authority comes from my ability to rule justly, not from whom I choose to love. If the nobility can't separate those things, that's their failing, not mine." "And if they threaten rebellion?" another councilman asked. "If refusing to end this relationship cost you the throne, then I'll gladly abdicate." Alderaan said simply and meant it. "I would rather live as a commoner with Catherine than rule as king without her." The shocked silence that followed that statement was profound. "You can't mean that," Aldrich finally said. "I've never meant anything more in my life," Alderaan replied. "I've fought 32 wars for this kingdom. I've given 40 years to the crown. I've sacrificed personal happiness, companionship, love, everything, for the sake of duty and tradition. And what did it get me? A kingdom so corrupted I didn't even know my own people were being enslaved. A nobility so focused on maintaining privilege that they'd rather rebel than accept reform. A life so isolated I forgot what it meant to connect with another person." He stood, his posture radiating absolute conviction. "Catherine reminded me that I'm not just a king. I'm a person, and that person deserves happiness as much as anyone else in this kingdom. If you can't accept that, then find yourselves a new king. I'm sure there are plenty of nobles who'd be thrilled to reverse my reforms and restore the old order." He left the council chamber without waiting for dismissal, without caring what they thought or decided. He found Catherine exactly where he knew she'd be, in the palace library, teaching Owen to read legal documents, both of them bent over thick books with the kind of concentration that made his heart ache with fondness. "How did it go?" Catherine asked, looking up with worry in her eyes. "I told them I'd abdicate rather than give you up," Alderaan replied casually, pulling up a chair. Catherine dropped her book. "You what?" "I said I'd abdicate. Quit. Resign. Hand in my crown and find a nice cottage somewhere where we can grow vegetables and argue about politics and watch Owen learn to shift without the weight of a kingdom on our shoulders." "You can't do that," Catherine protested. "The reforms, the changes, none of it will survive if you leave." "Then the nobility had better accept our relationship," Alderaan said with a slight smile. "Because I wasn't bluffing." Owen looked between them with wide eyes. "You'd really give up being king? For Cat? For Catherine? For you? For the chance to build a life that matters more than crowns and protocols?" "Yes, absolutely." Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "No, you worked too hard for this. We worked too hard. You can't throw it away because some nobles have outdated prejudices about rank." "Watch me," Alderaan said mildly. "This is emotional blackmail," Catherine accused. "You're forcing their hand by threatening to abdicate." "Actually, it's strategic negotiation," Alderaan corrected. "If they value my rule, and they do whether they admit it or not, then they'll compromise. If they don't value it enough to compromise on something as personal as whom I love, then I don't want to rule them anyway." Catherine paced, clearly agitated. "And if they call your bluff? If they accept your abdication?" "Then we'll be very happy commoners," Alderaan replied. "I hear farming is peaceful." "You don't know the first thing about farming." I didn't know the first thing about being a beggar either, but I learned quickly enough. He stood and caught her mid-pace, pulling her into his arms despite her protests. Catherine, listen to me. I spent 30 years being the perfect king, dutiful, strategic, utterly devoted to tradition and protocol, and I was miserable without even knowing it. These last 2 months, living with you, fighting for something that actually matters, building something real, have been more meaningful than 3 decades on the throne. So yes, if forced to choose, I choose you, every time, without hesitation. Catherine's resistance crumbled, and she sagged against him. You're completely insane. You've mentioned that before, Alderaan agreed, but you love me anyway. I do, Catherine admitted. Moon help me, I do. Then trust me on this. The nobility will bend. They always do when faced with a king who actually knows what he wants. A knock on the library door interrupted them. Meredith entered, her expression suggesting she knew exactly what she'd find. Your Majesty, the Noble Council has requested your immediate return. They say they're prepared to discuss accommodations. Alderaan smiled. Already? That was faster than I expected. You threatened to abdicate, Meredith said dryly. That tends to expedite negotiations. However, her tone turned serious. They're going to extract concessions. Be prepared for that. What kind of concessions? Catherine asked warily. The kind where you prove yourself worthy of standing beside a king, Meredith replied. They'll want tests, demonstrations, public approval. They'll make you earn what should be freely given. Let them test me, Catherine said, her spine straightening with determination. I've survived poverty, debt, forced labor threats, and war. A few noble trials don't frighten me. Alderaan felt pride surge through his chest. That's my girl. They returned to the council chamber together this time, Catherine's hand firmly clasped in Alderaan's, neither willing to hide or apologize for their connection. The councilman's expressions ranged from resigned to calculating. Your Majesty, Aldrich began carefully, the council has discussed your ultimatum. We're prepared to accept your relationship with the Omega girl. Catherine, Alderaan corrected again. With Catherine, Aldrich amended, on certain conditions. I'm listening, Alderaan said neutrally. First, she must prove herself capable of fulfilling duties appropriate to her position. We're not asking her to become queen. That would require noble blood regardless of personal merit. But if she's to be your acknowledged companion, she must demonstrate intelligence, grace, and political acumen. Catherine has been organizing Omega advocacy networks, teaching legal literacy, and implementing my reforms at the ground level, while you've been sitting in meetings complaining about those same reforms, Alderaan replied. If that's not intelligence and political acumen, I don't know what is. Several councilmen had the grace to look embarrassed. Second, Lady Morrigan continued, she must undergo formal education in history, politics, diplomacy, and law. Not because she's incapable, she held up a hand to forestall Alderaan's objection, but because navigating nobility requires specific knowledge of precedents, protocols, and political dynamics. We're willing to provide tutors and resources. Catherine spoke before Alderaan could. I accept that condition. I'd appreciate the education." The councilman looked surprised that she could speak for herself. "Third," Aldrich said, "there must be a formal courtship period of at least 6 months before any official announcement of permanent commitment. This gives the nobility time to adjust, gives Catherine time to learn what she's taking on, and gives everyone breathing room to ensure this is truly what you both want, rather than battlefield intensity creating false bonds." "Done." Alderaan agreed immediately, because 6 months was nothing compared to a lifetime, and it was a reasonable compromise. "Finally," Lady Morrigan said quietly, "you must both understand that this will be scrutinized constantly. Every mistake Catherine makes will be magnified. Every sign of favoritism will be criticized. Every reform that benefits Omegas will be attributed to her influence and questioned. You're not just accepting a relationship. You're accepting a political battle that will last years, possibly decades." "I fought a war to root out corruption that was killing my people," Alderaan said. "I can fight political battles to love the woman who showed me why that war mattered. And I've survived poverty and exploitation my entire life," Catherine added. "I can survive noble scrutiny." The councilmen exchanged glances, then nodded in collective acceptance. "Then we have an agreement," Aldrich said. "The council acknowledges your relationship with Catherine, will support reasonable reforms, will provide educational resources, and in 6 months will revisit the question of formalizing her position." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't unconditional acceptance, but it was progress, and sometimes progress was enough to build on. As they left the council chamber for the second time that day, Catherine leaned into Alderaan's side. 6 months of being watched constantly, judged harshly, and held to impossible standards. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything, Alderaan replied. Besides, I've seen you carry stones that should have broken your back. I've watched you work 3 jobs in one day. I've witnessed you maintain hope when you had every reason to despair. If anyone can handle noble scrutiny, it's you. You have entirely too much faith in me. Impossible, Alderaan said, and kissed her right there in the palace corridor. Not caring who saw or what they thought, because the beggar and the king had found each other against all odds. And nothing the nobility said or did would change that. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of change, challenge, and cautious hope. Catherine's education began immediately, and to the surprise of many nobles, she proved to be a remarkably quick study. Her years of struggling to survive had taught her to observe carefully, learn quickly, and adapt to new situations, skills that translated well to political education. Her history tutor, an elderly beta scholar named Professor Aldwin, was initially skeptical of teaching an Omega girl the intricate details of kingdom politics. That skepticism lasted approximately 1 week. She's extraordinary, he told Alderaan after Catherine's first month of lessons, his tone carrying genuine respect. She absorbs information like a sponge, makes connections between historical precedents and current situations, and asks questions that cut to the heart of complex issues. Frankly, Your Majesty, she has a better grasp of political dynamics than half your current council. Catherine also began attending select council meetings as an observer, learning by witnessing how decisions were made and policies implemented. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her comments were insightful and grounded in real-world experience the nobles often lacked. "You're proposing a tax increase on grain sales to fund infrastructure," she said, during one particularly contentious meeting. "Have you calculated how that will affect Omega families who already spend 60% of their income on food? Because if you haven't, you're about to trigger a hunger crisis in your lower ranks." The councilman had not, in fact, calculated that. The tax increase was modified to exempt basic food staples. Meanwhile, Owen was thriving in ways Catherine had never dared hope. With proper nutrition, medical care, and freedom from constant fear, he was growing stronger, healthier, more confident. He still hadn't shifted. His wolf remained stubbornly dormant, but he no longer seemed to see it as a fundamental failure. "Cat says my wolf will come when it's ready," he told Alderaan one afternoon when they were working together in the palace gardens. Owen had discovered a passion for horticulture, and until then, I'm still me, still valuable, still worthy of protection and love. "Your sister is a wise woman," Alderaan agreed. "She learned it from you," Owen replied with a grin. "You taught her that rank doesn't determine worth, that sharing bread with a beggar matters more than signing treaties with kings, that love transcends hierarchy." Alderaan felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I didn't teach her those things. I just reminded her of what she already knew." Public perception of Catherine's presence in the palace evolved gradually. The initial scandal gave way to cautious curiosity as people saw her actually working to implement reforms, not just enjoying palace luxury. When she spent 3 days personally helping reunite families separated by Boer's labor camps, visiting the facilities herself to ensure proper closure, public opinion shifted further in her favor. When she used her first formal appearance at a state dinner to auction off donated items and raise funds for Omega education programs, earning 50,000 gold crowns in one night, even some of the more resistant nobles grudgingly acknowledged she was more than a pretty distraction. But the challenges persisted. At month 3, a conservative faction tried to undermine her by spreading rumors that she was secretly controlling Alderaan, that every reform benefiting Omegas was actually her manipulation, rather than his genuine choice. Catherine addressed it head-on at the next public court session. "I've heard the whispers," she said, standing before hundreds of nobles and commoners alike, her voice clear and unwavering, "that I've corrupted the king, that I've manipulated him into betraying his class, that every change benefiting Omegas comes from my scheming rather than his sense of justice." She paused, letting the accusations hang in the air as, "I want to address that directly. Yes, I influence the king. I tell him when I think he's wrong. I share my experiences and perspectives. I argue with him about policy and implementation. That's what partners do. They influence each other, challenge each other, help each other grow." She turned to look at Alderaan, who stood beside the throne, his expression proud and supportive. "But the king doesn't need me to teach him compassion. He spent a month living as an Omega, experiencing poverty firsthand, witnessing injustice directly. The reforms aren't my ideas implemented through him. They're his ideas informed by real experience. I'm not corrupting the king. I'm just reminding him daily why the work matters." The hall erupted in applause, from the Omega section certainly, but also from many betas and even some alphas who appreciated the honesty. The rumors didn't stop completely, but they lost their power. At month 4, tragedy struck. An Omega boy, barely 16, was found dead in an alley, beaten to death by Beta youths who claimed they were teaching him his place. The murderers were arrested, but the incident sparked outrage across Omega communities and revealed how much work remained to change entrenched attitudes. Catherine attended the boy's funeral despite Alderon's security concerns. She stood with his grieving family, shared their tears, and then gave a speech that would be quoted for generations. "Ethan shouldn't be dead," she said, her voice breaking with grief and fury. "He should be alive, learning a trade, falling in love, discovering who he was meant to become. But he's dead because some people still believe Omegas are worth less than others, because some people still think violence against the weak is acceptable, because changing laws is easier than changing hearts." She paused, visibly composing herself, then continued with fierce determination. "But hearts can change. I've seen it. I've watched nobles who once sneered at Omegas begin to question their prejudices. I've seen beta merchants start paying fair wages. I've seen alpha landowners lease property on equitable terms. Change is possible, but only if we keep demanding it. Only if we keep fighting for it. Only if we refuse to accept that Ethan's death was inevitable or acceptable, or anything less than murder." The speech went viral throughout the kingdom, reprinted in broadsides, discussed in taverns, debated in council chambers. So some nobles were furious at her inflammatory rhetoric, but Omega communities began organizing with new energy. Inspired by someone who'd risen from poverty to stand beside the king and still remembered where she came from. At month 5, Catherine's wolf finally awakened. It happened during a particularly intense training session. Alderon had been teaching her basic self-defense, not because he expected her to fight battles, but because palace life had its own dangers, and she'd requested the training. They were sparring in the palace courtyard when something shifted inside Catherine. One moment she was human, blocking Alderon's practice strike. The next moment, her wolf surged forward with sudden, overwhelming power. She shifted for the first time in her life. Her wolf was smaller than an alpha's, but beautifully formed, silver-gray fur with darker markings around her eyes, lean and swift rather than heavy and powerful. She stood in the courtyard, overwhelmed by enhanced senses, by the feeling of rightness that came with finally having her wolf present. Alderon shifted too, his massive black wolf dwarfing hers, and they stood together in the courtyard, Alpha and Omega, king and companion, two wolves who had found each other against impossible odds. When they shifted back to human form, Catherine was crying. "I thought it would never happen," she whispered. "I thought I was like Owen, incomplete, broken." "You were never broken," Alderon interrupted gently, pulling her into his arms. "Your wolf was just waiting for the right moment, for safety, for security, for love." "She waited for you," Catherine realized. "My wolf waited until I found someone who made me feel safe enough to emerge." "Then I'm honored," Alderon said, and meant it with everything in him. The emergence of Catherine's wolf changed things politically, too. An Omega who could shift commanded more respect than one who couldn't, an unfair reality, but a useful one for their purposes. Noble opposition softened further as Catherine demonstrated she was a fully realized wolf, not a defective one. At month 6, the council reconvened to discuss Catherine's formal position. "She's exceeded every expectation we had," Lady Morrigan said, reviewing reports from tutors, advisors, and public opinion surveys. Her education is proceeding excellently. Her public work has been genuinely beneficial. Her influence on the king is clearly positive rather than manipulative, and the emergence of her wolf removes any questions about her being a complete shifter. "The question remains," Aldrich said. "What position is appropriate? She can't be queen. That requires noble blood, and no amount of personal merit changes bloodline requirements." "Then change the requirements," Alderaan said simply. The room fell silent. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said carefully, "bloodline requirements have existed for centuries. They're not just tradition, they're constitutional law. Changing them would require me to exercise my authority as Alpha King to amend constitutional law in accordance with evolved understanding of merit versus birthright," Alderaan interrupted. "Yes, I'm aware. I'm prepared to do exactly that." "You'd overturn centuries of precedent?" another councilman asked, shocked. "I've overturned centuries of precedent regarding forced labor, debt servitude, and Omega rights," Alderaan replied. "Overturning bloodline requirements for royal consorts is significantly less radical than anything I've already done." "The nobility will accept it," Alderaan said firmly, "because by now even the most resistant nobles recognize that Catherine is more qualified to stand beside me than any noble-born beta who's never experienced hardship, never fought for anything, never learned what it means to survive and still choose kindness." He looked around the room, meeting each councilman's eyes. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm informing you of my decision. Catherine will be queen. We'll marry by summer's end. The constitutional amendments will be drafted and implemented. Anyone who has fundamental objections to this plan may present them now." No one spoke. "Good," Alderaan said. "Lady Morrigan, please work with our legal scholars to draft the necessary amendments. I want them ready for review within 2 weeks." As the councilmen filed out, some looking resigned, others thoughtful, a few actually appearing pleased, Catherine stood beside Alderaan, her hand in his. "You just changed constitutional law for me," she said quietly. "I changed constitutional law to reflect reality," Alderaan corrected. "You earned this position. I'm just making sure the law acknowledges what everyone with eyes can see, that you're the best possible choice to stand beside me, regardless of your birth rank." "I love you," Catherine said, the words carrying weight beyond simple affection. Not for the crown, not for the position, not for changing laws, just for being you, for seeing me when I was invisible, for choosing me when you could have anyone." "I love you too," Alderaan replied, "for showing me what mattered when I'd forgotten, for challenging me to be better, for being brave enough to share your bread with a beggar and wise enough to accept a king's love when it was offered." They stood together in the council chamber, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd fought battles external and internal to reach this moment. The beggar was gone. The desperate Omega was transformed. But the love that had sparked between them by a cold fire pit remained, stronger now for having survived scrutiny and challenge. In 3 months, Catherine would become queen, and the kingdom would finally understand that strength came in many forms, including an Omega girl who'd taught an Alpha King how to be human again. The wedding was planned for the summer solstice, a date chosen for its symbolic significance, the longest day of the year, representing hope, light, and new beginnings. To be continued. Watch out for Part 3. If this story made you feel the growl, if you felt the claim, the love, the danger, like the video, subscribe, and join the pack, because the next Lycan King is already watching.